Would you judge a man by the clothes he wears? This manager did, and it cost him everything. Picture this. A showroom so pristine it could pass for a palace. Spotless white marble floors stretched endlessly, glass walls shimmered under dazzling lights, and rows of high-end sports cars stood like untouchable masterpieces. It was the kind of place where millionaires strolled in, ready to drop absurd amounts of cash just because they could. And then there was Malcolm. The heavy glass door swung open as Malcolm stepped inside, his entrance shifting the room's energy instantly. His boots, caked with dried mud from hours on the farm, left faint traces on the immaculate floor. The sweat-stained flannel shirt clinging to his frame seemed out of place amidst the showroom's polished sophistication. Frayed jeans revealed years of hard work, while the faint scent of fresh soil clung to him, contrasting sharply with the leather and cologne that filled the air. He carried something intangible, an aura of authenticity, that felt almost foreign here. A few salesmen stole quick glances before returning to their conversations. A couple browsing an electric blue sports car turned their heads, whispering among themselves. But then there was Brad Simmons, the showroom manager. Standing by the front desk, laughing at something on his phone, Brad froze the moment Malcolm walked in. His jaw tightened, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes scanning Malcolm like he didn't belong. Before Malcolm could take more than a few steps, Brad moved in, cutting him off. "Sir," Brad said, his voice dripping with forced politeness, "can I help you with something?" Malcolm, unfazed, glanced around the showroom. "Yeah, I was hoping to take a look at the new limited edition model. Heard you had one in stock." Brad let out a short, almost amused breath. He looked Malcolm up and down, taking in the dirt-streaked clothes, rough hands, and faded cap. "We don't exactly do test drives for just anyone," Brad replied, tilting his head slightly. "This isn't the kind of place where you, just browse." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "So?" Brad folded his arms, his smirk widening. "Maybe you'd have better luck at one of the dealerships across town. They've got a solid selection of used trucks." Before Malcolm could respond, the glass door swung open again. Another figure entered, but Brad didn't bother turning around. His focus remained locked on Malcolm, ensuring he didn't venture further into the showroom. Malcolm exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. He'd dealt with men like Brad before, different faces, same attitude. Half of him wanted to turn around and leave, but something told him to stay. "I'm not looking for a used truck," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "I came here for a reason." Brad chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if he'd heard this all before. "Sir, this is a luxury dealership. Our clientele is selective." He emphasized the last word, letting it hang between them like a challenge. Nearby, a younger salesman in a sharp suit shifted uncomfortably, overhearing the exchange. He glanced between Malcolm and Brad, debating whether to intervene, but said nothing. Malcolm adjusted his cap, meeting Brad's gaze head-on. "Selective, huh?" Brad's smirk didn't waver. "That's right." The tension thickened, stretching across the showroom like an invisible rope pulling tighter. A woman inspecting a silver sports car shot them a sideways glance before pretending not to notice. Malcolm sighed, stuffing his calloused hands into his pockets. "You know," he said, shaking his head slightly, "I've worked hard my whole life. Built something from the ground up. Funny thing about money, it doesn't always dress the way you expect it to." Brad's expression barely flickered. If anything, he looked more entertained. "I'm sure that's true," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "But our customers don't usually track dirt into the showroom." His eyes dropped to Malcolm's boots, then flicked back up. "Unless you're here for something realistic." He gestured lazily toward the exit. "I don't want to waste your time." The younger salesman shifted again, opening his mouth to speak, but Brad shot him a look that silenced him immediately. Malcolm let out a low, knowing laugh. He'd expected this reaction. It wasn't the first time, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But before he could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Hey, Dad, sorry I took so long." Brad froze mid-expression, slowly turning his head toward the voice. The man who had just walked in was polished perfection, tailored navy suit, crisp white shirt, sleek designer watch catching the light just right. He moved with effortless confidence, the kind that made people step aside without him asking. "Jared," Malcolm said, giving a small nod, his face unreadable. "You're late," Jared replied with a chuckle, walking toward him. Imagine walking into a room where the air shifts instantly, not because of what's said, but because of who walks in. That's exactly what happened when Jared entered the showroom. Yeah, got caught up with some last-minute calls, he said casually, clapping Malcolm on the shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world. But then his sharp gaze flicked toward Brad, and the entire atmosphere changed. The tension that had been simmering between Brad and Malcolm snapped, replaced by something far more intense, panic. Brad blinked rapidly, his mouth slightly open as his brain scrambled to process what was happening. His eyes darted back and forth between Malcolm and Jared, searching for an explanation, a misunderstanding, anything. Malcolm, the man Brad had dismissed moments ago as just another broke farmer who wandered in by accident, was Jared's father. Jared frowned slightly, glancing from Brad to Malcolm. "I see you've already met my dad," he said, his tone casual but laced with a dangerous edge. Brad opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The younger salesman, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort, suddenly found a reason to check something on his clipboard, avoiding eye contact entirely. A deep silence settled over the showroom, stretching unbearably. A few customers, sensing something big was about to happen, subtly repositioned themselves to listen in. Finally, Brad found his voice, but it came out weak. I didn't realize." Jared tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Didn't realize what, exactly?" Brad swallowed hard. "I mean, I didn't know he was," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Jared cut him off before he could try again. "Rich." His tone was icy now, and Brad flinched visibly. Malcolm stayed silent, watching intently as Jared stepped closer to Brad. "So let me get this straight," Jared began slowly, piecing it together in real time. "You saw a black man walk in here wearing work clothes, and instead of treating him like a paying customer, you decided he didn't belong." Brad opened his mouth to defend himself, then shut it just as quickly. His carefully polished confidence had crumbled completely. Jared let the silence drag, savoring the weight of it before turning to Malcolm. "Did he even let you see the car?" Malcolm shook his head. "Didn't get that far." Jared exhaled sharply, looking back at Brad with something bordering on disgust. "This is interesting," he said, his voice carrying across the eerily quiet showroom. "Because I was planning on buying 3 cars today. Cash." A soft gasp came from someone in the background. Even the other employees, who had been pretending not to notice, stiffened noticeably. Brad's face drained of color. Jared adjusted his cuff, his eyes locked onto Brad's. "But now, I think I'll take my business somewhere else." Brad physically jolted, like someone had kicked the back of his knees. "Wait, Mr. Carter," he pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. Jared held up a hand, stopping him cold. "No, you had your chance." Brad looked around frantically, as if searching for someone to save him. But the younger salesman had suddenly become very busy inspecting a car's price tag, and the other employees knew better than to get involved. Malcolm smirked slightly, adjusting his cap. "Guess we'll get those cars somewhere else, huh?" Jared turned to him, nodding. "Yeah, somewhere that actually deserves our money." Together, they turned and headed for the door. But Brad wasn't done yet. As Malcolm and Jared walked toward the exit, Brad's breath hitched. His mind raced. He had to fix this, and fast. "Wait," he blurted, stepping forward. "Mr. Carter, please, let me talk about this." His voice had shifted completely. Gone was the smug arrogance, now it was all desperation. Jared didn't even slow down, but Malcolm paused just before reaching the exit. He turned slightly, lifting an eyebrow. "Talk about what, exactly?" Brad hurried to close the gap between them, forcing an awkward, ingratiating smile. "This was a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice coated in fake warmth. "I had no idea he was family." Jared scoffed, shaking his head. "Family." He turned to face Brad fully now, crossing his arms. "So if he wasn't my father, you'd still be throwing him out?" Brad froze, his face pale. Jared let the silence drag, letting the question hang heavy in the air. "See, that's the problem," Jared continued, stepping closer. "You don't treat people with respect. You treat money with respect. And if you can't see past someone's appearance to recognize their value, what happens when arrogance meets accountability?" That's exactly what Brad was about to find out. Jared leaned in, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the tension like a knife. "Here's what's going to happen, Brad," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're going to watch us walk out that door, and you're going to remember this moment, the next time you judge someone by their clothes instead of their character." Brad's eyes flicked desperately to Malcolm, pleading. Sir, please, but Malcolm had already turned away, his expression unreadable. And just like that, the biggest sale of Brad's career walked right out the door. The glass swung shut behind them with a finality that echoed through the showroom, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt suffocating. Inside, Brad stood frozen, his face twisted into an awkward half-smile, half-grimace, as if his brain hadn't fully processed what had just happened. The younger salesman, who had been watching everything unfold with barely concealed discomfort, finally exhaled and muttered under his breath, "Wow." A few other employees exchanged glances. They'd seen Brad act this way before, maybe not this blatantly, but they recognized the pattern, the arrogance, the subtle exclusions, the way he catered to certain customers while dismissing others outright. It wasn't new, but this time, it had gone too far. The consequences were only beginning to ripple outward. A woman who had been eyeing a sleek red convertible turned to her husband and whispered, "Did that just happen?" Her husband, still staring at the now closed door, shook his head slowly. "Yeah," he replied, his voice tinged with disbelief. "And I don't think I want to buy from here anymore." Brad snapped out of his daze, whipping his head toward the younger salesman. "Why didn't you say something?" he hissed, as though shifting the blame onto someone else would somehow fix the mess he'd created. The younger man blinked, caught off guard. "What was I supposed to do? Tell you not to be a jerk?" Brad's jaw clenched tightly as he spun back toward the front desk, reaching for his phone. He had to fix this. He'd call Jared Carter's office, apologize, offer a discount, anything. But before he could even unlock the screen, the dealership's regional manager, Mr. Langford, walked in, and from the look on his face, it was clear he'd seen everything. Brad's stomach twisted into knots as he straightened up, trying, and failing, to compose himself. "Sir, Langford held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Save it," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "What happens when a single moment of arrogance becomes a lesson for everyone watching?" That's exactly what Brad was about to learn the hard way. As Mr. Langford, the regional manager, walked into the showroom, his sharp gaze swept across the room before landing on Brad. "My office, now," Langford said, his voice cutting through the suffocating silence like a blade. Brad's stomach plummeted as Langford turned and strode toward his office. Every pair of eyes in the showroom stayed glued to Brad. Customers, salespeople, even the receptionist had stopped typing mid-sentence. Brad swallowed hard, his mind racing. He'd been in this industry long enough to know he wasn't walking out of that office with his job intact. But what about Malcolm and Jared? Their day wasn't over yet. Outside, Malcolm and Jared stepped into the warm afternoon sun, the tension from inside the showroom rolling off their shoulders like dust shaken from old boots. Jared pulled out his keys, unlocking the doors to his sleek black SUV. He paused, glancing at his father. "You all right?" Malcolm let out a slow breath, then smirked. "You know, I've been disrespected before," he said, his tone calm but laced with quiet satisfaction. "But watching that man's face when he realized who I was, that was something else." Jared chuckled, shaking his head. "You handled that better than I would have." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Oh, I don't know. You did pretty well putting him in his place." He slid into the passenger seat, adjusting his cap. "I'm guessing he won't be working there much longer." Jared started the engine, the soft hum of the car filling the silence. "That's not really the point, though," he said after a moment. "Firing one guy doesn't fix the problem. There are 100 more just like him, thinking they can size people up based on their clothes, their accent, their skin." Malcolm nodded slowly, rubbing his palms together. "Yeah, but people like that, they always show themselves. The world has a way of humbling a man who thinks he's above others." Jared pulled out of the parking lot, his grip firm on the wheel. "Still, I don't like seeing you treated that way." Malcolm gave him a knowing glance. "Son, I've been treated that way long before you were even born." Jared exhaled sharply, hating how normal this kind of treatment seemed to be for his father. They drove in silence for a moment, the city blurring past outside the windows. Then Malcolm spoke again, breaking the quiet. "You know what the best part of today was?" Jared arched an eyebrow. "What?" Malcolm smirked, leaning back in his seat. Watching him beg, Jared burst out laughing, shaking his head. "All right, that was satisfying." Malcolm chuckled too, but then his expression grew serious. "Listen," he said, turning to his son. "You handled that the right way. You let him dig his own grave, then you buried him with his own words. You didn't yell, didn't lose your temper, you let the truth speak for itself. Jared nodded, letting the words sink in. After a beat, Malcolm added, that's how you really teach people a lesson, not by arguing, but by making them face the weight of their own mistakes. Jared thought about that as they turned onto the highway. So, where to now? He asked, glancing at his father. Malcolm grinned, stretching out his legs. Someplace where the salesmen actually know how to do their jobs. Jared chuckled. You got it, old man. As they drove off, the luxury dealership faded into the distance, just another place that lost more than just money that day. Because respect, that's something money can't buy. Have you ever been judged by your appearance before people even knew who you were? Or seen someone else get treated unfairly just because they didn't look the part? It happens more than we think, and the only way to change it is to call it out when we see it. Treat people with respect, not because of what they have, but because of who they are. If this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's keep the conversation going because, at the end of the day, character matters more than status.